Close your eyes and take a deep breath. Today I invite you into a legend that rises from between the marble columns of ancient Greece, stirring the silvery leaves of olive trees. An epic whispered tirelessly by the winds for centuries, a tale even time itself has failed to erode. This story tells not only of the silence of a king's palace, but of a great and dangerous secret fused with divine power in a woman's womb. We follow the footprints of the young Theseus, who pulls his destiny from beneath a massive stone no one dared to move, armed with a rusted sword and dust-covered sandals. This is the story of a courage equal to the lion-cloaked might of his cousin Heracles, and of the bloody, winding road leading to the rightful throne of Athens. Theseus is not merely a prince. He is the last hope of a kingdom writhing in the grip of the ambitious Palantides, a volunteer who feels the breath of the Minotaur on his neck in the pitch-black depths of the Labyrinth, and a struggle for survival distilled through the poisoned cups of the cunning sorceress Medea. In a fate where the remorse of a mortal king and the power of Poseidon, Lord of the Seas, flow through the same vein, you will witness the birth of a hero. Disclaimer: the visuals in this video were created using artificial intelligence. There are no bloody or disturbing scenes. However, some moments have been designed for cinematic and emotional depth. If you are sensitive to such imagery, please keep this in mind before watching. If you wish to join me on these mythic journeys, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and leave a comment below telling me which story you'd like to explore next. I look forward to sailing through these timeless tales together, one legend at a time. Take a deep breath, relax your mind, and let the rhythm of the waves guide you, wishing you a peaceful sleep. The epic of Theseus and the Minotaur begins now. Listen carefully. As the first colors of dawn slowly paint the sky, I will tell you this epic. This is the story of a dark prophecy tied at the mouth of a wineskin and a bronze sword hidden beneath a stone. The legend of Theseus, who would one day become not only the king of Athens but its very soul. In very ancient times, in ancient Greece, where legends rose among marble columns and olive trees, King Aegeus ruled behind the high walls of Athens. Aegeus was a noble ruler, descended from the line of Theseus, believed to be born directly from the very soil itself. Yet the footsteps echoing through the grand halls of the palace carried news of a deep sorrow in the king's heart. For despite the vast throne of Athens, he had not a single child to succeed him, to carry on his name and bloodline. This sorrow was not merely a longing for fatherhood, but a grave danger to Athens' future. The king's brother, Pallas, was an ambitious and ruthless man, and he had no fewer than 50 sons. Known in mythology as the Palantides, these 50 brothers constantly mocked their uncle Aegeus for his childlessness, roaming the palace like vultures, waiting for the old king to die without an heir, so the throne might fall to them like carrion. With each passing day, Athens was shaken more deeply by the unrest and intrigue stirred by these 50 brothers. Seeking to save both his lineage and Athens itself from the Palantides, Aegeus decided to listen to the voice of the gods. He set out on a long journey to Delphi, believed to be the most sacred place of the age, where the voice of the god Apollo was said to descend to the mortal world. There, amid mysterious fumes, the high priestess Pythia, who saw the future, looked upon the king and whispered one of the most complex prophecies in history. "O great leader of your people, loosen not the hanging mouth of the wineskin until you reach the highest point of Athens, otherwise you will die of grief." Aegeus struggled to understand these cryptic words. Was the oracle warning him not to drink wine until he returned to Athens, or telling him not to lie with a woman? His mind filled with questions, he chose not to return directly to Athens, but instead to stop along the way at a small yet wise city, Troezen. In Troezen ruled King Pythius, an ancient friend of Aegeus. Pythius was the son of Pelops and was famed throughout the Greek world for his wisdom, his eloquence, and his mastery of the hidden meanings behind words. When Aegeus shared the riddle of Delphi with him, the wise king immediately grasped its true meaning. If Aegeus lay with a woman before reaching Athens, the child born would become one of the greatest heroes the world would ever know. But this would also lead Aegeus toward a tragic end. Pythius was not only intelligent, but ambitious. He desired that his own bloodline might one day rule a great city like Athens. For this reason, he concealed the dangerous part of the prophecy from his friend. He welcomed Aegeus into his palace with the richest and strongest wines, drinking with him until the grieving king's mind was completely clouded. When King Aegeus became so drunk that he no longer knew what he was doing, Pythius sent his own daughter, Aethra, to him. Yet that night, it was not only a king's cunning plan that moved above the palace of Troezen. The will of the gods was at work as well. That same night, the wise princess Aethra dreamed of Athena, goddess of war and wisdom. Following the goddess's command, she went to the seashore to the sacred island of Sphaeria. As she walked upon the sands of the island, Poseidon, the true lord of the seas and the earth-shaking god, appeared to her and joined with the young woman. Thus in a single night Aethra conceived, carrying within her womb the seed of both a mortal king, Aegeus, and an unstoppable god, Poseidon. This union placed a unique seal upon the character of the child who would later be born, blending human determination and intelligence with divine invincibility. Theseus would come into the world as both the rightful heir of a king and the son of the sea. When Aegeus awoke the next morning and realized that Pythius's daughter was pregnant by him, he was seized by great fear and anxiety. If the 50 nephews in Athens, the Palantides, learned that an heir had been born, they would commit any evil necessary to destroy the child while he was still in his cradle. For this reason, Aegeus led Aethra to a remote and rocky hill near Troezen. There he found a massive, heavy stone, nearly impossible to move. The king took a bronze sword and a pair of sandals and placed them in a hidden hollow beneath the stone. These items were the symbols of his kingship and would serve as seals by which he could recognize his son in years to come. Looking into Aethra's eyes, Aegeus gave his final command. If a son is born to us, raise him here in secret. When the child grows strong enough to move this heavy stone and take what lies beneath it, send him to me in Athens with this sword and these sandals, without letting anyone see him. With a heavy heart, Aegeus departed from Troezen and returned to Athens to guard his throne beneath the shadow of the Palantides. Yet another dangerous force awaited him in his palace, Medea. Medea had come from the distant land of Colchis, a woman who knew the languages of plants and the darkest secrets of sorcery, ambitious enough to kill even her own children. In his desperation to have an heir, Aegeus had been deceived by Medea's magical potions and had built a life with her. Medea sought to rule Athens through her influence over the king, and the existence of Theseus would become the greatest threat to her dark designs. In time, Aethra gave birth to a strong male child. with the divine spark shining in his eyes, and she named him Theseus. Theseus was raised within the protective palace of his grandfather, King Pythias, under the guidance of his disciplined tutor, Conidas. Conidas taught him not only how to wield a sword or wrestle, but also the justice and virtues a true leader must possess. So enduring was his legacy that even years later, the Athenians would remember this teacher and offer sacrifices to Conidas during ceremonies held in honor of Theseus. Throughout his childhood, Theseus stood out among his peers as larger, sharper, and more courageous than the rest. To protect him, his mother Aethra guarded the secret that his true father was King Aegeus with great care. Among the people of the city, rumors spread that Theseus was the son of Poseidon, a belief that filled the people of Troezen with pride, for the god of the seas was their chief protector and most revered deity. As the young Theseus grew, the true fire in his spirit was fueled by the legends of his cousin, the greatest hero in the world, Heracles. Tales of Heracles cleansing the world of monsters and triumphing over tyrants filled Theseus's dreams and pushed him toward his own destiny. With every story of his cousin's deeds, Theseus grew more impatient to prove the strength of his own arm. This childhood, lived under the shadow of prophecy and sealed by a hidden sword and sandals, stood on the brink of great tragedy and great victory. Unaware that beneath the silent stone he passed each day lay both the throne of Athens and the beginning of his own heroic tale, Theseus grew up on stories carried by the wind from distant lands. On the sun-washed shores of Troezen, growing beneath the shade of olive trees, the young Theseus had reached the threshold between childhood and manhood. He had been raised in the palace of his grandfather, King Pythias, as a noble and virtuous prince. Pythias, son of Pelops and known as one of the wisest men of his age, spared no effort to ensure that his grandson was trained not only in strength, but also in mind and moral character, as befit a ruler. Another figure deeply involved in Theseus's upbringing was his tutor, Conidas. Conidas taught the young prince how to wield a sword, how to wrestle, and how to remain steadfast in the face of hardship. So lasting was his influence that even years later, the Athenians would remember this retired tutor and offer sacrifices in his name during festivals held in honor of the hero. Among the people of Troezen, there was a widespread belief about Theseus's father. Everyone believed he was the son of Poseidon, the mighty god of the sea and storms. His mother Aethra and his grandfather Pythias had deliberately encouraged this legend to protect the child. For if the 50 ruthless cousins in Athens, the Pallantides, the ambitious sons of Pallas, were to learn that his true father was King Aegeus of Athens, and that a legitimate heir to the throne existed, they would try every means to destroy Theseus while he was still in his cradle. Thus, throughout his childhood, Theseus believed himself to be the son of a god, and with each passing day he grew stronger, fueled by what he thought was divine blood. Time passed swiftly, and Theseus became a young man larger, sharper, and braver than his peers. When he reached adolescence, following the custom of the age, he traveled to Delphi to dedicate his hair to the god Apollo. Yet he did not cut it as others did. Instead, he shaved only the front of his hair, adopting a warrior's style. This style would later be known by his name as the Theseus cut. The time had now come for his mother Aethra to reveal the great secret. One day she took Theseus with her to the desolate rocky slopes of Troezen to the mysterious hill where she had once walked years earlier with his father Aegeus. At the highest point of the hill stood a massive stone, so heavy it seemed impossible to move. Looking deeply into her son's eyes, with both tenderness and gravity, Aethra told him the truth. "My son, your father is not only a god, but also Aegeus, the powerful king of Athens." As Theseus stood in stunned silence, she continued, "When your father left this place, he hid precious tokens for you beneath this stone. If you are strong enough to lift it, then you are ready to claim your place as heir to the Athenian throne." Theseus understood that his fate lay beneath that heavy mass. Without hesitation, he stepped toward the stone. In his veins flowed both the determination of a king and the divine strength of Poseidon. He pressed his shoulder against the stone's cold surface, took a deep breath and pushed with all his might. For a moment, time itself seemed to stop. His muscles tightened, a grinding sound rose from the depths of the earth, and Theseus lifted the massive stone as easily as if it were a feather. Beneath it was a hollow carefully carved years earlier by King Aegeus. Amid dust and spiderwebs lay a bronze sword still bearing the splendor of kingship and a pair of golden sandals. These were Aegeus's tokens of recognition. When the king would one day see his son again, the sword at his waist and the sandals on his feet would tell him at once that this young man was of his own blood. When Theseus grasped the sword, the ring of metal leaving its sheath echoed across the hill. When he put on the sandals, he felt his feet stand more firmly upon the earth. These sacred items were like a divine confirmation that he was no longer merely a prince of Troezen, but the future ruler of Athens. As Aethra watched her son's achievement with tear-filled eyes, she felt both pride and deep fear for the dangers that awaited him. The tokens had been claimed, but the true trial was only beginning. His mother and his grandfather Pythias pleaded with Theseus to choose the sea route to reach his father. In those days, travel by sea was fast, safe, and comfortable. Boarding a ship from Troezen and sailing directly to Piraeus, the harbor of Athens, would take only a few days. The land route, however, was filled with terrifying dangers. At that time, the lands of Hellas were plagued by savage bandits and monsters who trusted only in their physical strength and used it solely for cruelty, plunder, and murder. These brutes believed neither in justice nor in compassion. For them, only brute force and mercilessness mattered. Many of these monsters and highwaymen had once been destroyed by Theseus's cousin, the greatest hero in the world, Heracles. But Heracles had recently suffered a great misfortune and, as punishment, had gone to serve as a slave to Queen Omphale in Lydia. Taking advantage of the hero's absence, old evils had returned to the roads, setting traps at every turn. Wise Pythias tried at length to dissuade his grandson from the land route, describing each of these roadblockers in detail. Their cruelties, their tortures, and their merciless treatment of strangers. But the soul of young Theseus had already been ignited by the glorious victories of Heracles. He dreamed of his cousin's legends at night and spent his days imagining deeds worthy of standing beside them. To Theseus, traveling by sea would mean appearing before his father not as a hero in the making, but as a coward seeking safety. He could not bear to present himself to Aegeus with a sword still unstained by blood and sandals untouched by dust. To him, a man's true proof lay not in the objects left to him by his father, but in the noble and courageous deeds he accomplished along the road. While my cousin Heracles cleanses the land of monsters, why should I hide behind a safe ship and flee to my father? He declared. Swearing never to wrong the innocent, but to punish those who used violence against him by their own methods, he chose the land route. Despite the worried tears of his mother Aethra and his grandfather Pythias, he stepped beyond the walls of Troezen for the first time, Aegeus's sword in his hand. This journey would be not only the story of a son seeking his father, but the epic of Athens' greatest king, proving himself in a world filled with monsters and bandits. As Theseus left behind his peaceful childhood, history itself awaited him on every twist of the dangerous, dusty roads ahead, ready to witness the birth of a hero. He was no longer just a prince, but a traveler sworn to write his destiny with the strength of his own arm. Standing atop the rugged cliffs of Troezen, the young Theseus, who had pulled his destiny from beneath a stone, the secret son of Aegeus, king of Athens, and a hero carrying the divine power of Poseidon in his veins, had now left his childhood behind. In his hand he carried the bronze sword of his father, King Aegeus, the sorrowful ruler of Athens and Theseus's biological father. On his feet were the golden sandals that once belonged to him. Yet these tokens were more than mere objects to Theseus. They were the burden of a nobility that still had to be proven. His mother Aethra, daughter of Pythias and the princess who had carried this great secret in her heart for years, and his grandfather King Pythias, son of Pelops and the founder of Troezen, renowned for his wisdom and powerful speech, felt both pride and deep fear at the young man's decision to go to Athens. Wise Pythias tried to persuade his grandson by explaining how safe and short the sea route to Athens was. Traveling by ship, one could reach Piraeus, the harbor of Athens, in just a few days, an easy journey, far from danger. The land route, however, was in the grip of monsters in human form, savage bandits who used their strength only for cruelty and plunder. These brutes trusted in their extraordinary physical power and agility, viewing justice, mercy, and love for humanity as nothing more than inventions of the weak who lacked the courage to commit evil. Many of these criminals had once been destroyed by the greatest hero the world had ever known, Theseus's own cousin Heracles, the son of Alcmaeon, famed for his divine strength. But Heracles had suffered a tragic accident and killed EPILOGUE, and as punishment for this crime, he had been sent to serve as a slave to Queen Omphale in the lands of Lydia. Taking advantage of the hero's absence, ancient evils had begun to rise again across Hellas. The roads were left unguarded, and every turn became a deadly trap. Pythias tried at length to dissuade Theseus from this path, describing in detail how cruel each of these highwaymen was, the horrific tortures they inflicted on travelers, and what kinds of monsters they truly were. But the soul of young Theseus had already been set ablaze by the legends of Heracles. At night he dreamed of his cousin's triumphs. By day he listened eagerly to every tale of heroism that reached his ears. To Theseus, choosing the safety of the sea meant appearing before his father not as a worthy heir, but as a cowardly fugitive. He could not bring himself to present Aegeus with a sword still clean of enemy blood and sandals untouched by dust. In his eyes, a man's true proof lay not in the objects left to him by his father, but in the glorious deeds he earned through his own strength. Despite his mother's tears and his grandfather's wise warnings, he swore never to harm the innocent, yet to punish without mercy those who used violence against him. And with that vow he took his first step beyond the walls of Troezen. The first stop on Theseus's dangerous journey toward Athens lay in the lands of Epidaurus, along the coast of the Saronic Gulf. The greatest terror of this region, the nightmare of travelers, was PERIPHETES, also known as Coronetes, the bandit infamous for the massive iron club he wielded. PERIPHETES was of divine descent, the son of Hephaestus, god of fire and the forge, and of Anticlea. From his father he had inherited enormous strength, but his legs were crippled and weak. To compensate for this flaw, he carried an iron club of crushing weight, forged in his father's workshop. Because of this fearsome weapon, the people called him Coronetes, the club bearer. PERIPHETES lay in ambush in the darkest parts of the forests or in narrow mountain passes, stopping innocent travelers and, without cause, crushing them to death with his heavy club. As Theseus walked along the shadowed, silent roads of Epidaurus, this massive, savage-looking man suddenly appeared before him. PERIPHETES saw the young, solitary traveler as easy prey and, with his usual arrogance, blocked his path and raised the iron club high. He trusted too much in brute force to notice the noble bearing of the young man or the divine resolve in his eyes. But Theseus possessed not only strength, but also agility, inherited from his father Poseidon, the mighty lord of the seas, and a sharp, calculating mind. When PERIPHETES swung his club with full force to crush Theseus's head, the young hero dodged aside with lightning speed, avoiding the deadly blow. The club struck the ground with such force that the earth itself seemed to tremble, but Theseus was already counter-attacking. This struggle was more than a fight between two men. It was the first true test of savage banditry against real heroism and justice. Theseus engaged PERIPHETES at close quarters and soon overcame the outlaw. He delivered justice by killing PERIPHETES with his own weapon, the very iron club he had used for years to murder innocent people. This victory became the first bloody seal on Theseus's road to Athens and the first great proof of his heroism. When Theseus lifted the heavy iron club from the ground, he was struck by its balance and power. Just as his cousin Heracles had proudly worn the skin of the Nemean lion as armor, Theseus decided to claim PERIPHETES' club as his own weapon. In his hands, the club was no longer an instrument of cruelty, but a sacred weapon that protected the helpless and stood as an unshakable symbol of his first great victory. Thus, with PERIPHETES' iron club in his hand and Aegeus' sword at his waist, Theseus continued on his way. Behind him lay the body of a tyrant who would harm no one ever again. Ahead of him stretched many more roads and many more monsters yet to be cleansed. As the young man pressed forward with the confidence of having passed his first trial, he did not yet know that his legend, born in the forests of Epidaurus, would spread across the entire Greek world. By choosing the land route, he had declared to gods and men alike not only his physical strength but also his will to rid the world of evil. Yet the narrow passes of the Isthmus of Corinth and the steep cliffs of Megara were preparing to test him against enemies far more cunning and far more dangerous. With every strike of the heavy club in his hand, Theseus was laying, stone by stone, the road that would lead him to his father's throne. Young Theseus, the secret son of Aegeus, king of Athens, and a hero who carried the divine power of Poseidon, after defeating his first great enemy, the bandit PERIPHETES, the iron club giant, in the forests of Epidaurus, using the man's own weapon, continued on his journey carrying that heavy iron club. This club was no longer just a weapon for him. Like the lion skin worn by his cousin Heracles, the greatest hero in the world and Theseus' inspiration, it was a symbol of his victory and exceptional courage. However, the land route to Athens was still filled with unpurged horrors. In the narrow and dangerous passes of the Isthmus of Corinth, far more cunning and ruthless enemies were waiting for him. When Theseus reached the windy shores of the Corinthian Isthmus, he encountered Sinis, the cruel bandit known as the Pine Bender. Sinis was the son of Polypemon, a vicious bandit father, and used his enormous physical strength to torture innocent travelers. His method was both horrifying and unimaginable. He would bend two powerful pine trees all the way down to the ground, tie his unfortunate victim between them, and then suddenly release the trees. As the trees snapped back to their original position at great speed, the victim's body would be torn in two and hurled apart. When Sinis saw this young and solitary traveler, Theseus, he assumed he would be easy prey and attacked him. But although Theseus had never faced such a trick before, he resisted with his heroic spirit and intelligence. Their struggle was short but brutal. Theseus overpowered the giant bandit with his own strength and brought him down. To ensure justice was served, Theseus punished Sinis using the very method he had inflicted on his victims. He bent the two great pine trees, tied the bandit to them, and released them, causing Sinis to die by his own cruel device. After this, Sinis's beautiful daughter Perigune, Sinis's daughter who was hiding in the mountains, fled in fear. But Theseus promised her he would not harm her and took her under his protection. As Theseus continued his journey, he faced not only monsters in human form, but also savage beasts. In the lands of Crommyon, a region near Megara, there lived a massive and ferocious female boar named Heir, which terrorized the people. Some claimed this boar descended from the monstrous Echidna and Typhon, while others argued that it was actually a wild and murderous female bandit known by the nickname the Sow. Believing that a true hero must fight not only those who attack him personally, but all evils that threaten the people, Theseus changed his course to seek out this monster. After a brief search, he found the savage creature and, after a hard battle, killed it, freeing the region from a great menace. When Theseus reached the steep cliffs at the border of Megara, he encountered Siren, the bandit who threw travelers into the sea, who lay in wait where the road narrowed. Siren would stop passing strangers and, with arrogant manners, force them to wash his feet. As the travelers bent down to do so, Siren would suddenly kick them hard, sending them off the cliffs and into the sea. Below the cliffs waited a massive turtle, ready to tear apart the bodies of the victims. When Theseus approached Siren, the bandit ordered him as usual to wash his feet. Theseus moved quickly to break this insolent game. He grabbed the bandit, lifted him up, and hurled him into the sea from the very cliff where Siren had thrown his victims. Thus Siren died by his own trick, upon the bones of those he had killed. According to some accounts, the cliffs afterward became known as the Cyronian Cliffs, and it was said that the scattered bones eventually turned to stone. As Theseus drew closer to Athens, his next stop was the sacred city of Eleusis, a city near Athens. Its ruler was a tyrant named Cercyon, the gigantic and brutal wrestler king of Eleusis. Cercyon forced all travelers to wrestle with him and mercilessly killed those he defeated. When Cercyon saw Theseus, he immediately challenged him to a wrestling match. However, Theseus defeated the tyrant not through brute force alone, but with superior technique and speed. He lifted Cercyon into the air and slammed him to the ground with such force that the giant tyrant died on the spot. This victory proved to all of Hellas, Greece, that Theseus was not only a warrior, but also a highly skilled athlete. As Theseus began to see the walls of Athens on the horizon, he encountered the last and most deceitful bandit on the road, Damostes, commonly known as Procrustes, meaning the stretcher. Procrustes lived in a house near Erineus, a region close to Eleusis, and invited travelers into his home under the guise of hospitality. Inside, he had 2 beds, one long and one short. If the guest was short, he would lay them on the long bed and stretch their legs until their bones broke so their body would fit. If the guest was tall, he would place them on the short bed and cut off the parts that extended beyond it, the legs or the head, with an axe. When Theseus learned of Procrustes' horrific trick, he captured him and placed him on his own bed. He punished and killed the bandit exactly as he had done to his victims, making his body fit the bed perfectly. With this final trial, Theseus completely cleared the road to Athens of monsters and cruel bandits. When Theseus arrived in Athens, he left behind cleared roads, cities restored to peace, and a legend spreading from mouth to mouth. The courage, intelligence, and poetic justice he displayed along the way, punishing tyrants by their own methods, caused the people to call him a second Heracles. Although he had not yet met his father Aegeus, the sorrowful king of Athens, his fame had reached the palace before him. Upon entering Athenian territory, he encountered members of the Phytalidae, the noble family who purified Theseus through sacred rites on the banks of the Cephissus River, a sacred river in Athens. These kind people purified Theseus through religious rituals to free him from the spiritual burden of the blood he had shed along the road, even though it was the blood of tyrants, and they welcomed him into their home. This was the first true hospitality Theseus experienced on his journey to Athens. Now the young hero stood at the gates of Athens with his father's sword at his waist, his father's sandals on his feet, and the great fame he had earned in his hands. However, the palace did not hold only his father's love. The cunning sorceress Medea, Aegeus's wife at the time, who sought to eliminate Theseus to protect her own interests, had sensed who this young stranger was and had prepared dark plans to end his life. Theseus had defeated monsters, but he was now about to enter his most difficult trial yet, the labyrinth of family and betrayal. Young Theseus, the secret son of Aegeus, king of Athens, and a hero who carried the divine power of Poseidon in his veins. After setting out from Troezen and subduing every bandit and monster along the land route, finally reached the walls of Athens, the city of his destiny. The calendar marked the 8th day of the month of Cronius, now called Hecatombion. This date would be remembered by the Athenians as the day a hero first set foot in their city. Yet when Theseus stepped beyond the magnificent walls, he did not find the peaceful homeland he had imagined. Instead, Athens at that time was gripped by political turmoil and a hidden danger within the palace itself. The people of the city were divided into factions, and unrest and chaos had spread into every street. Inside the palace, the situation was far worse. Theseus's father, King Aegeus, had grown old and was worn down by years of fatigue and the constant fear of losing his throne. Because of the unrest in the city and his fear of assassination at any moment, the king had become unable to trust anyone. Taking advantage of this weakness, there was someone living at his side, Medea. Medea was an ambitious woman from the distant land of Colchis in the Caucasus, who had fled with her brother's blood on her hands and an abandoned past behind her, a sorceress with no limits to her magic. After the tragic events she had experienced with the great hero Jason, she had fled Corinth and sought refuge in Athens. By promising the aged King Aegeus that she could give him a child through her magical potions and elixirs, Medea gained his trust and settled into the palace like a queen. As she glided through the cold marble halls of the Athenian palace, Medea was not only a wife, but also a figure shaping the future of the kingdom within her womb. Using Aegeus's sorrowful old age and fear of childlessness like a drug, Medea had given him a son, Medus. Medus was raised under his mother's sorcerous hands, with the belief that he was the rightful heir to Athens. Medea's true goal was to secure the Athenian throne for her own son Medus, the son of Medea and Aegeus. When Theseus entered the city, he had not yet revealed who he was to anyone. Yet although he appeared to be an ordinary traveler, the stories of the bandits he had defeated had reached the city before him and were already spreading among the people like a legend. King Aegeus heard of the people's admiration for this new stranger, but he trembled in his corner, completely unaware that this young man was his own son. Medea, however, was no ordinary person. Through her dark magic and her ability to see what was to come, she sensed the identity of this young stranger long before Aegeus did. Realizing that Theseus was the hidden heir Aegeus had left behind in Troezen, Medea was seized by panic. If this young man were recognized by his father, all of Medea's plans would collapse and her son Medus would never become king. Using her cunning intelligence, Medea began to inflame Aegeus's fears. She whispered to the king that this stranger who had arrived in the city was actually an agent of the Pallantides, the 50 nephews who sought to seize Aegeus's throne, or a spy sent to destroy the kingdom from within. Believing these warnings from his wife, Aegeus was overcome with fear, because Medea had always served as his advisor. Medea convinced Aegeus that this dangerous stranger had to be eliminated. But it would not be done with a sword. It would be done quietly during a dinner. To destroy Theseus, Medea prepared one of her most terrifying weapons, aconite, wolfsbane poison. According to legend, this poison came from the foam dripping from the mouth of Cerberus, the three-headed dog guarding the gates of the underworld. When the great hero Heracles brought Cerberus up to the surface as part of his 12th labor, the beast was terrified by the daylight and scattered its poisonous saliva everywhere. This saliva hardened on the harsh rocks of Scythia and turned into a deadly plant. Using extracts from this dark plant, Medea prepared the poison and waited to present it to Theseus under the mask of hospitality. Under Medea's influence, Aegeus invited this stranger to the palace for a banquet. The true purpose of the feast was not to honor the hero, but to end his life. When young Theseus entered his father's palace, his heart was pounding with excitement. At last, he would meet the father he had longed for. Instead, he found an old king looking at him with suspicion, and Medea, whose eyes carried a deadly glint. When they sat at the table, Medea urged the king to hand the poisoned cup to Theseus. As Aegeus extended the golden cup carrying death toward Theseus, one of the greatest tragedies in history was about to unfold. Theseus reached out his hand to accept the deadly offering from his father, but at that very moment he decided to make a move to prove himself and ensure that his father would recognize him. This banquet table was not merely a place for a meal, it was an arena of survival. As Medea's dark clouds gathered over Theseus, the young hero waited for the right moment to reveal the untarnished sword at his waist and the sandals he had kept hidden. Yet the poisoned cup could touch his lips at any second, and Aegeus stood on the brink of killing his own son with his own hand. The fate of Athens was hidden in the final sip of that evening's feast. When the banquet table was set, Theseus sat down with a heart full of longing for his father. Across from him stood his father Aegeus, worn down by years and fear, and Medea, whose eyes carried a deadly gleam. Instead of revealing his identity at once and shattering everything, Theseus wanted to wait for his father to recognize him and was watching for the right moment. What the young hero did not know, however, was that the magnificent halls of the Athenian palace were not only a symbol of wealth, but also the center of a quiet and treacherous betrayal. Every sound echoing within the palace walls struck old King Aegeus's heart like an arrow of fear. In those days, Athens was under siege not only from outside, but from within as well. The 50 sons of the king's brother Pallas, the Pallantides, were lurking everywhere like vultures, waiting for their uncle to die childless. Aegeus feared that this young stranger, who had entered the city after defeating giants and bandits along the road, might be an assassin sent by his nephews. The one who exploited the king's weakness and longing for an heir for her own benefit was the sorceress Medea. She had come to Athens from the distant land of Colchis, seeking refuge with her brother's blood on her hands and the secrets of dark magic. By promising Aegeus that she could give him a child with her magical potions, she had become both his wife and his closest advisor. Her goal was to place her own son, Medus, on the throne of Athens. Yet through her dark arts, Medea had sensed the identity of this young stranger long before Aegeus did. He was Theseus, the hidden heir from Troezen. If this young man were to embrace his father, all of Medea's dreams of power would vanish in an instant. The banquet table was filled with every kind of delicacy, but the tension made the air heavy. Each time Theseus saw the cold looks his father cast at him, his heart sank. If he does not recognize me himself, he thought, then I must reveal myself. When the servants brought large cuts of meat to the table, Theseus drew the sword at his waist. This was no ordinary weapon. It was the sacred token personally hidden years earlier by Aegeus beneath the massive rock in Troezen, adorned with ivory carvings. As the sword gleamed in the torchlight, Aegeus's eyes were drawn to the familiar family markings and the ivory engravings on the hilt. In that moment, everything became clear in Aegeus's mind. The cryptic prophecy at Delphi, the farewell night in Troezen, and his dream that one day his son would return with this very sword all flashed before his eyes in an instant. The young man standing before him was not an enemy come to destroy Athens, but his own flesh and blood. With a cry of terror and remorse, King Aegeus leapt to his feet. Just as Theseus was about to raise the poisoned cup to his lips, his father lunged forward and struck the cup from his son's hand. The golden goblet rang as it rolled across the marble floor, spilling its deadly poison onto the palace ground. It is said that the place where the poison was spilled was near what is now known in Athens as the Delphinium, close to the house of Aegeus. With trembling hands, Aegeus embraced his son and proclaimed him his rightful heir before all the people. When the Athenians learned that this brave young man who had cleared the roads of monsters was their own prince, they poured into the streets in great joy. Yet during this embrace, Medea realized that her plans had failed and that death was closing in on her. Calling upon her magic, she escaped. According to legend, she mounted her winged chariot drawn by dragons and fled Athens, vanishing into the dark clouds she created. Theseus' recognition as a hero in the palace drove the Pallantides, the 50 nephews of the king, into a rage. These brothers, who had been waiting for Aegeus to die old and childless, declared, "We will never allow a stranger and an outsider to take the throne of Athens," and prepared for war. The Pallantides devised a cunning plan and split into two groups. One group, led by Pallas himself, marched openly toward the city, while the other waited in ambush at Gargetus, intending to trap Theseus between two forces. However, a messenger named Laos secretly revealed this treacherous plan to Theseus. As soon as he received the warning, Theseus launched a sudden attack on the ambushing group and put them all to the sword. When the other group learned that the ambushers had been destroyed, they scattered in fear. After this victory, the Athenians embraced Theseus not only as a prince, but as the true protector of their city. In honor of his salvation and his reunion with his son, King Aegeus had all the altars in the palace lit and offered sacrifices to the gods. It seemed as though the dark days for Athens were over. As Theseus took his place at his father's right side, the Athenians greeted him, saying, "O great Theseus, hero who subdued the wild bull of Marathon and cleared our roads of bandits." Yet hanging over this great celebration and joy was a dark shadow coming from the island of Crete. Before long, the ships of King Minos of Crete would appear in the harbor, reminding Athens that the time had come for the bloody tribute demanded every 9 years, 7 young men and 7 young women to be sent to the Minotaur. As Theseus began his new life in his father's palace, he did not yet know that he was standing on the threshold of the greatest monster and the darkest labyrinth that awaited him. The peace that followed Theseus's return to the Athenian palace as the true son of Aegeus and the new heir to Athens, and the defeat of his 50 ambitious cousins, the Pallantides, did not last long. While a festive mood filled the city within its walls, dark shapes appeared on the horizon, signaling an ancient pain and a bloody debt yet to be paid. As the people of Athens rejoiced in having a hero like Theseus, they realized that the time had come once again for the recurring nightmare that arrived every 9 years, the sending of the Cretan tributes. The roots of this curse lay in the innocent blood spilled years earlier on Athenian soil, the death of Androgeos, the son of King Minos of Crete, whose murder had angered the gods. According to legend, Minos, son of Zeus and Europa, ruler of the seas and king of Crete with its 100 cities, had sent his son Androgeos to compete in the Panathenaic Games in Athens. Young Androgeos defeated all his rivals with his extraordinary strength and agility, surpassing Athens' finest athletes and winning every prize. Yet this success planted seeds of fear and jealousy in the heart of King Aegeus, father of Theseus. Aegeus worried that this popular foreign prince might ally himself with his nephews who sought to seize the throne. Some accounts say the old king sent Androgeos to face the savage bull of Marathon, which was terrorizing the land at the time, and that the young prince died there. Other versions claim that Androgeos was ambushed and treacherously murdered. When Minos received news of his son's death, He was driven mad with grief and rage. At the time, he was on the island of Paros offering sacrifices to the Graces. Upon hearing the news, he threw down his crown and silenced the flutes, yet he did not interrupt the sacrifice. For this reason, it is said that on Paros, sacrifices have been offered without music or garlands ever since. Determined to avenge his son, Minos assembled one of the greatest fleets the ancient world had ever seen, subjugated the Greek islands one by one, and marched against Athens. On his way to Athens, Minos first laid siege to Megara, ruled by Naxos, the brother of Aegeus. Naxos possessed a single purple lock of hair imbued with divine power, which was the safeguard of both his life and his kingdom. During the siege, Naxos' daughter Scylla saw Minos from the city walls and was captivated by the enemy king's majesty and noble presence. Blinded by love, she decided to betray her father to win Minos' affection. One night, while her father slept, she secretly entered his chamber and cut off the sacred purple lock. When she presented this act of treachery to Minos as a token of love, she received no reward. Minos, renowned for his sense of justice and law, was disgusted by a woman who would betray her own father. Though he captured Megara, he cursed Scylla and had her tied to the stern of his ship, leaving her to drown in the sea. When Minos' army reached the gates of Athens, even the gods joined the Cretan king's vengeance. A devastating famine and a relentless plague struck the land. Rivers dried up, and the soil no longer yielded crops. The oracles of Apollo declared that these disasters would end only if Minos' anger were appeased. In utter desperation, the Athenians were forced to accept the king's terms. According to the agreement, every 9 years, Athens would send 7 young men and 7 young women to Crete as tribute. Upon arriving in Crete, these youths were cast into the Labyrinth, a dark maze filled with countless misleading corridors, built by the legendary craftsman Daedalus, who had fled Athens and entered Minos' service. No one who entered ever found the way out. At the center of the labyrinth lived a terrifying monster, the Minotaur. This creature, half man, half bull, was born from the unnatural union of Pasiphae, Minos' wife and daughter of the sun god Helios, and a sacred bull sent by Poseidon for Minos to sacrifice. Minos had spared the bull, and the gods punished him for it. The Minotaur fed on the Athenian youth sent into the labyrinth. When the time came for the third tribute, mournful cries and angry murmurs filled the streets of Athens. The people shouted that King Aegeus was responsible for all these disasters, yet he himself had never paid the price. The recognition of Theseus as a prince enraged Athenian fathers who were preparing to sacrifice their own children. Because of his mistakes, he leaves us childless, they cried, yet he makes his own foreign and illegitimate son his heir. They gathered at the palace gates, demanding justice. When these accusations reached Theseus's ears, the young hero could not remain silent. He had cleared the roads of bandits, but true heroism meant sharing in the suffering of his people. Despite his father Aegeus's desperate pleas, tears, and attempts to stop him, Theseus chose to volunteer as one of the tributes. If he could defeat the Minotaur, the cursed agreement would end forever. When the ship carrying the tributes was brought to the harbor, black sails, the symbol of mourning, were raised. These black sails signified the certainty of death that had always awaited the youths sent before. Yet this time, there was also hope aboard. Seeing his son's determination, Aegeus gave him a white sail as well. According to some sources, a bright red sail dyed with crimson flowers. The old king whispered a firm command to Theseus and the ship's pilot. "If you defeat the monster and return alive, lower the black sails and raise the white sail as a sign of victory. But if you bring news of death, keep the black sails raised, so I may see my grief from afar." Without taking any weapons, since the terms of the agreement required the tributes to be unarmed, Theseus boarded the ship with 13 innocent youths. As the people of Athens wept on the shore, Theseus' upright stance and the divine resolve in his eyes kindled a faint but powerful hope that this dark age, endured for centuries, might finally come to an end. As the ship caught the wind and sailed toward the steep cliffs of Crete and the blood-soaked corridors of the Labyrinth, Theseus was not merely going to face a monster, but the fate of an entire nation. While the echoes of the great reunion celebrated within the walls of Athens, in the palace of King Aegeus, had not yet faded, a sorrow heavier than marble columns descended upon the city gates. The people of Athens had embraced the young hero Theseus, the son recognized by Aegeus's sword, and the brave man who carried the power of Poseidon, who had cleared the roads of monsters, yet the sly wheels of fate never ceased to turn. The calendars now marked the arrival of the cursed envoys from the island of Crete for the third cycle of sacrifice. This was Athens' darkest wound, a bloody tribute paid every 9 years as the price for the killing of Androgeos, son of King Minos of Crete, the son of Zeus, ruler of the seas and a king burning with the fire of vengeance, who had been slain on Attic soil. Before the journey, Theseus went to consult the oracle at the temple of Apollo in Delphi for this sacred mission. The seer whispered to him that, on this dangerous path, he should take Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, as his guide. By the seashore, Theseus sacrificed a female goat to the goddess. According to legend, as the animal was being sacrificed, it suddenly turned into a male goat, a sign taken as proof that the goddess had blessed the journey. When the day of departure came, all of Athens poured down to the harbor, to the shores of Phalerum. Theseus boarded the ship together with the other 13 unfortunate youths. Among them were 2 brave-hearted companions with delicate feminine features, whom Theseus had disguised and placed among the girls. With their help, he planned to form a stronger resistance inside the labyrinth. As the people of Athens wailed and cried laments after the departing victims, King Aegeus stood at the far edge of the harbor, waving until the ship disappeared from sight. Theseus set out to face a colossal enemy without the sword his father had left him, since the sacrifices were required to go to Crete unarmed, relying only on his bare hands and his divine intelligence. The ship filled its black sails with wind and began to glide across the deep blue waters of the Aegean Sea. Throughout the voyage, Theseus comforted the other youths, giving them courage and assuring them that they would defeat the monster. With the pilot Nausithouse at the helm and the lookout Phaeax scanning the horizon, these skilled sailors were Theseus's greatest allies, for the Athenians of that era had not yet mastered the art of seafaring. As they passed among the Aegean islands, Theseus felt the blood and power of Poseidon, the god of the seas and his divine father, flowing through his veins. Every wave, every whisper of wind carried him toward a great trial, the dark corridors where the breath of the Minotaur could be heard. When the rugged cliffs of Crete and the magnificent yet terrifying palace of Minos at NAXOS appeared on the horizon, Theseus knew that he carried not only the fate of 7 youths, but also the honor of grieving Athens itself. This journey was not merely a voyage of sacrifice, it was the beginning of an epic in which a hero would destroy the monster in its own lair and deliver his people into freedom. The black-sailed ship that had departed from the sorrowful shores of Athens traveled across the deep blue waters of the Aegean with the wind at its back and finally reached the magnificent harbor of Crete, the island of 100 cities. When the young Theseus stepped ashore with the 6 young men and 7 young women beside him, they found themselves at the heart of one of the most powerful kingdoms of the ancient world. King Minos was not merely a ruler, he was the absolute master of the seas, a towering force of divine lineage as the son of Zeus and Europa. The city walls, raised by the genius of the architect Daedalus, and the marble columns of Knossos gleaming under the sun, inspired both awe and deep fear in the Athenian victims. As Theseus walked from the harbor toward the palace, he felt the curious and pitying gazes of the Cretan people upon him. Yet he did not walk like a captive sent to be sacrificed. He carried himself with his head held high, with a nobility worthy of the blood of Poseidon flowing in his veins and of King Aegeus. He kept the fire of heroism alive within him by recalling the promise he had made to his father when leaving Athens and the bandits he had defeated along the way. At the heart of the palace, in Minos' throne room, the air was heavier than ever. King Minos burned with the desire to avenge the betrayal and death of his son Androgeos in Athens. This grief had turned him into a harsher and more ruthless ruler. Yet Minos' troubles did not end with this outward hostility. Hidden within the palace walls was a terrible family secret that stained the king's honor, known as a double-natured shame. The king's wife, Persephone, had been struck by a divine curse and developed an uncontrollable desire for a white bull. The famed architect Daedalus built a wooden contraption covered with cowhide so that the queen could satisfy this desire, and Persephone entered it and united with the bull. From this twisted union was born the Minotaur, half man and half bull, the greatest source of shame in the Cretan palace. Instead of killing the creature, Minos once again turned to the genius of Daedalus and imprisoned it in the most complex structure in the world, the Labyrinth. This structure was a vast maze of corridors designed to deceive, where anyone who entered could never find the way out. Even its creator, Daedalus himself, struggled to escape it. The Athenian youths had been brought to Crete precisely to feed this dark monster. When the Athenian victims arrived at the palace, King Minos was holding grand funeral games and athletic contests in honor of his dead son, Androgeos. These competitions served as a chance to display Crete's military and physical strength to both friends and enemies. The greatest champion of the games and Minos' most trusted commander was General Taurus. Taurus was known as unbeatable, not only on the battlefield, but also on the wrestling ground. However, his reputation among the people had been badly damaged by his crude and arrogant behavior, and rumors circulated through the palace corridors of a secret and improper closeness between him and Queen Persephone. Minos was deeply troubled by the general's arrogance and by these rumors. When Theseus was brought to the palace, he asked the king for permission for himself and the other youths to take part in the games before being thrown into the dungeon. Minos accepted this request, both to test Theseus's courage and because he wished to see Taurus's pride broken. When the day of the contests arrived, the vast arena of Knossos was packed. Among the spectators sat Ariadne, the daughter of King Minos, the most graceful and sorrowful figure of the Cretan palace. When Ariadne saw this young foreigner waiting to be sacrificed, her heart felt a stirring she had never known before. Theseus entered the arena not like a doomed prisoner, but like a god radiating light. Ariadne was deeply affected by his imposing presence, the breadth of his shoulders, and the fearless determination in his eyes. This was the purest form of what historians and poets would describe for centuries as love at first sight. The most important moment of the contests was the wrestling match between Theseus and General Taurus. Taurus approached Theseus with a mocking smile, believing he could easily crush this young Athenian. But Theseus possessed not only physical strength, but also divine agility inherited from his father Poseidon and superior technique. As the match began, the arena fell silent. Taurus tried to overpower Theseus with brute force, while Theseus skillfully neutralized each of his opponent's moves. Finally, before the astonished eyes of the crowd, Theseus seized the massive Taurus, lifted him into the air and slammed him to the ground with tremendous force flat on his back. This victory completely destroyed Taurus's reputation and inspired great admiration among the people of Naxos. Even King Minos took great satisfaction in seeing Taurus humiliated and his arrogance crushed. Minos was so impressed by Theseus's success that, according to some accounts, he even considered freeing the other Athenian youths or easing the tribute. Yet the true knot of fate still waited to be tied at the center of the labyrinth. This victory transformed the love in Ariadne's heart into unshakable resolve. The young princess could not stand by and watch this brave man vanish into the darkness of the labyrinth. Even at the cost of betraying her father, Minos's authority and the laws of Crete, she began to make plans to save Theseus. As Ariadne's gaze locked onto Theseus, Theseus also noticed the noble woman watching him with admiration. But the contests had ended, and the sun was beginning to withdraw from above Naxos. The guards led Theseus and the other youths back to their dark cells to spend their final night before entering the labyrinth. Even as he savored his victory, Theseus's mind was filled with the unsolvable corridors of the labyrinth and the savage roar of the Minotaur. That night in the palace of Minos, it was not only wine that was poured, but also the delicate and vital bond that would be forged between a hero's life and a princess's love. Under the sun-scorched lands of Crete, among the marble columns of the palace of Knossos, a deep silence reigned. Yet this silence was not one of peace, but a sign of an approaching great tragedy and an emerging heroic epic. While the Athenian victims waited in dark dungeons for the day they would be thrown into the bloody corridors of the Minotaur, another storm was breaking on the upper floors of the palace. Ariadne, the daughter of King Minos, had given her heart to a young foreigner, the Athenian prince Theseus, after witnessing the immense strength and nobility he displayed during the funeral games. According to the sources, from the very moment she first saw Theseus, Ariadne had been captivated by his imposing stance, his athletic skill, and the way he humiliated the proud General Taurus on the wrestling ground. This love was not merely the passion of a young woman, it was also the earthly reflection of a divine intervention that would pull a hero back from the grip of death. As Ariadne walked through the corridors of the palace of Naxos, her soul was torn by a deep inner conflict. On one side stood her loyalty to her father, King Minos. On the other, the irresistible love she felt for the prince of an enemy people. The monster born from her mother Persephone's union with the bull, The Minotaur, that double-natured shame, was in fact Ariadne's own brother. Feeding that creature with human sacrifices every 9 years was a requirement of Cretan law. Yet in Ariadne's eyes, Theseus was not a sacrifice but a light that had to be protected at the cost of her own life. She knew that once Theseus entered the labyrinth, he would never be able to leave, for the maze had been designed by the genius architect Daedalus to be so complex that it was impossible for anyone to find their way back out. The princess decided to secretly visit Theseus, who was waiting in his cell in the middle of the night. For her, this decision was both an act of treason against her homeland and a victory of love. When she appeared before Theseus, she won his heart not only with her beauty, but also with the hope of salvation she offered. Ariadne made Theseus a clear proposal. If she helped him kill the monster and escape alive, Theseus would take her to Athens and make her his wife. According to Apollodorus, Ariadne set this condition before him. If you swear that you will take me with you to Athens and make me your wife, I will show you the way out of the labyrinth. Theseus gave her that promise with a sacred oath, not only to save his own life, but also to save the lives of the 7 young men and 7 young women with him. This promise was the first knot tying together the fates of 2 lives and 2 peoples. When Ariadne decided to help Theseus, the true key to this secret lay with the very man who had built the labyrinth, the architect Daedalus. According to some sources, Ariadne had learned how to escape the labyrinth directly from Daedalus himself. Daedalus knew very well that the unpredictable turns of the corridors he had designed concealed the path leading back out. It was he who whispered to Ariadne that anyone entering the maze would need to use a ball of thread in order to find the way back. In the darkness of night, under the flickering light of torches, Ariadne handed Theseus that famous ball of thread. This thread was not merely a strand of linen, it was the thin line between life and death. Ariadne's instructions were clear. The moment he entered the labyrinth, he was to tie one end of the thread to the entrance and unwind the ball as he moved forward. After killing the monster, he would follow the thread along the ground to retrace his steps through the tangled corridors and return to where he had begun, to freedom. This brilliant yet simple method was a defense created by love and reason against the genius of Daedalus. As Theseus gripped the thread tightly, he understood that the determination in Ariadne's eyes and the tools she offered were far more powerful than brute strength. Ariadne and Theseus planned not only an escape from the labyrinth, but a complete escape from Crete itself, for King Minos would not let the killing of the monster go unpunished once he learned of it. The plan grew broader. After leaving the labyrinth, Theseus would have to evade the palace guards, free the other Athenian youths, and reach his ship in the harbor. But there was a major obstacle, the powerful fleet of Minos. Before entering the labyrinth, Theseus made a strategic move to prevent their escape from being blocked. According to the sources, Theseus secretly damaged the hulls of the Cretan ships, carving into them or opening holes. The purpose of this sabotage was to make it impossible for Minos' ships to give chase while the Athenian victims were escaping. If Minos' soldiers tried to board the ships and set sail, the vessels would take on water and sink. This proved that Theseus was not only a warrior, but also a far-sighted military leader. The final stage of the plan was the collective escape. In a midnight operation, those who survived the labyrinth, along with Ariadne, boarded the black-sailed ship waiting in the harbor and quietly set out onto the dark waters of the Aegean. Their destination was first the island of Naxos, and then Athens. As Ariadne left behind her homeland, her father and her family, she suppressed her grief with the hope of the new life she would find in Theseus's arms. For Theseus, however, that promise stood above everything else. The honor of a prince would be tested by the vow of marriage he had given to the woman who saved his life. So what had happened inside the labyrinth? As the burning sun of Crete warmed the marble courtyards of the palace of Knossos, time itself seemed to slow to a halt for Theseus and the young victims who stood with him. By the order of King Minos, the hour had come for Athens to pay its bloody tribute. Theseus, together with his 13 companions, was brought before the massive gates of the Labyrinth, the most complex and terrifying structure in the world. This place had been built by the famous architect Daedalus to hide the half-man, half-bull monster, the Minotaur, who was the great shame of King Minos. As Theseus stood at the threshold, he looked back one last time at the world he was leaving behind. Princess Ariadne felt the weight of the promise she had given him and of the famous ball of thread she held tightly in her heart. Following her instructions, Theseus tied one end of the thread firmly to the frame of the entrance. This thin strand was not only the way out of the labyrinth, but also the single bridge between life and death. When the doors slammed shut with a thunderous sound, Theseus and his companions found themselves trapped in the cold, suffocating silence of stone walls. The air inside was nothing like the fresh Aegean breeze outside. It was heavy, damp, and filled with the smell of death that had built up over centuries. Slowly unwinding the thread, Theseus took his first step into the depths of darkness. The labyrinth had been designed to confuse the mind and condemn anyone who entered to an endless maze with no escape. Daedalus had built it so cleverly that the corridors twisted back on themselves like the Meander River of Phrygia, completely destroying any sense of direction. Every turn looked like the last, and every crossroads invited a new mistake. As Theseus moved forward, he imagined the scratch marks of earlier victims on the stone walls and the final words carved there in despair. Those who had entered these dark passages had either died between the monster's teeth or become part of the labyrinth itself, wasting away from hunger and thirst after failing to find a way out. Theseus could hear the trembling breaths of the 6 young men and 7 young women walking beside him. Each of them was thinking of their families in Athens, the lives they had left behind, and the black sails raised for their certain death. Theseus, however, held his fear in check by remembering the promise he had made to his father Aegeus and the heroic blood flowing through his veins. Deep inside the labyrinth, the silence became more frightening than any enemy. Every step of Theseus's sandals echoed loudly against the stone floor, as if each sound were calling the monster closer. In places where all light vanished, he could feel only the cold surface of the stone beneath his fingers and the tension of the thread in his hand. The darkness was complete, trapping the mind and breaking the sense of time. Fear began to spread through the hearts of the young people like a creeping vine. According to some accounts, Theseus was not entirely alone. 2 brave companions, disguised among the girls, were also with him. Even so, the raw terror of the monster's presence tested the will of even the bravest. Every corner felt like a place where the Minotaur might leap out at any moment. The creature, the double-natured shame born of Pasiphae, was somewhere behind these walls, waiting for its victims. Theseus felt that he was nearing the center of the labyrinth, the lair of the beast. From deep within the silence came low growls and the sound of heavy breathing that made the bones ache. This was the savage presence of the Minotaur, felt even in its sleep. Theseus tightened his grip on the thread. In that moment he carried not only his own life, but the honor and salvation of Athens. Thinking of Heracles and the monsters he had defeated, Theseus strengthened his spirit. There was no escape now, only confrontation. As the corridors narrowed, the walls seemed ready to collapse inward. Daedalus's genius crushed not only the body, but the mind as well. Theseus thought of the point where the thread began, of the daylight waiting outside. But ahead of him, there was only stone, darkness, and silence. When the Athenian youths noticed that Theseus had stopped, they stopped as well. They could not see one another's faces in the dark, but they all shared the same prayer, that this nightmare would end. Keeping one hand on the wall, Theseus moved forward again. The moss and dampness on the stone told of how ancient and cursed this place was. With every step, the ball of thread felt lighter in his hand. It was nearly used up, meaning the monster was very close. Fear was no longer an obstacle for Theseus. It had become an ally, sharpening his senses. With his sword ready, or according to some stories with only his bare hands, he stepped into the final corridor that opened into the deepest and widest chamber of the labyrinth. The silence broke, replaced by a heavy roar and the trembling of massive footsteps drawing near. From within the darkness, Theseus saw wild, glowing eyes staring back at him. Between the stone walls of the labyrinth, the birth of a hero, or the end of a people, was about to be decided. When Theseus took his first step into the pitch-black darkness of the labyrinth, holding the life-saving thread given by Ariadne, the sound of the massive doors closing behind him echoed through every corridor. The air inside was thick with dampness, decay, and the heavy smell of death rising from the bones of innocent youths who had previously been sacrificed to the monster. Designed by the brilliant mind of the architect Daedalus, this structure was a deceptive web of passages that twisted back on themselves like the Meander River in Phrygia, exhausting those who entered and making them forget where they had begun. At every turn, Theseus held tightly to one end of the thread, knowing that this thin linen strand was the only bridge connecting him back to daylight and freedom. Silence was the labyrinth's greatest enemy. Every step of Theseus's sandals against the stone floor grew louder, like a drumbeat that might awaken the monster from its sleep. As the other youths huddled together in fear, Theseus felt the divine strength of Poseidon, god of the seas, flowing through his veins, along with the honor of his father Aegeus. As he drew closer to the center of the labyrinth, claw marks on the walls and torn scraps of clothing became more frequent, clear signs of how merciless the coming battle would be. At the very heart of the maze waited the Minotaur, known as the double-natured shame. As Euripides described it, the creature was a hybrid monster, born from the union of two different natures, human and bull. Its upper body was crowned with the magnificent and savage head of a bull, while its lower body was that of a human, wrapped in massive muscles. Born from Pasiphae, daughter of the sun god Helios, and her forbidden desire for Poseidon's sacred bull, the creature had grown strong in its dark prison, feeding on the flesh of Athenian youths. When Theseus entered the wide chamber at the center of the labyrinth, he came face to face with the Minotaur's bloodshot eyes, glowing in the darkness. The monster had caught the scent of new victims and roared with hunger and rage. The sound was powerful enough to shake the very foundations of the palace of Knossos. By agreement, Theseus had been forced to enter the labyrinth without any weapons. Yet he remembered the day he had defeated General Taurus, the strongest man in Crete, using only his bare hands and his wrestling skill. In this ultimate test of strength and courage, the heroic prince relied solely on his arms and his God-given intelligence. Lowering its horns, the monster charged at Theseus at full speed. With a last-second move, Theseus leapt aside and the beast's massive body slammed into the stone wall, making the labyrinth tremble. The fight continued in the darkness, amid dust and blood. Theseus managed to grab one of the monster's horns. This was not just a battle of physical power, but a struggle of civilization against savagery, of reason against blind instinct. Climbing onto the creature, Theseus tried to lock his arms around its powerful neck. The Minotaur thrashed wildly, trying to throw off this victim and tear Theseus apart with its claws. But Theseus showed the endurance he had gained on the rocky roads of Troezen and the strength he had once used to lift the heavy stone that hid his father's sword. Sources say that Theseus killed the monster with his fists, or, according to some accounts, with one of the creature's own horns torn from its head. With a final effort, gathering all his strength, the hero forced the monster's head back, broke its neck, or strangled it until it drew its last breath. When the Minotaur collapsed to the ground with a final growl, a deep and heavy silence fell over the labyrinth. Crete's long-standing bloody shadow had finally been destroyed. Theseus rose to his feet, covered in blood, but victorious. This triumph not only saved the lives of 7 young men and 7 young women, it also ended forever the cursed tribute Athens had been forced to pay. Yet the hardest part was still ahead. He had to escape this dark tomb. Feeling his way through the darkness, Theseus found the thin linen thread Ariadne had given him. By following it back, retracing his path, he overcame the countless misleading corridors, dead ends and hidden traps of the labyrinth one by one. As the thread tightened and he drew closer to the exit, a faint beam of light appeared at the far end of the passage. When he reached the gates of the labyrinth, he found Ariadne waiting there, torn between fear and hope. The young princess had saved the life of the man she loved and committed a great betrayal against her father, King Minos. Keeping the promise he had made, Theseus took Ariadne with him and quietly led all the surviving Athenian youths toward the harbor. The escape plan, however, was already in motion. Before entering the labyrinth, or immediately after leaving it, Theseus had made a brilliant move to prevent the Cretan fleet from pursuing them. He had drilled holes in the hulls and damaged the keels of the Cretan ships. As a result, when the Athenian ships set sail and Minos' soldiers boarded their own vessels to give chase, the ships would quickly take on water and sink. At midnight, with the wind at its back, the black-sailed ship sped away from the shores of Crete. Theseus, having defeated death in the depths of the labyrinth, achieved the impossible and changed the fate of a nation as he sailed into the deep blue waters of the Aegean Sea. Behind him, the corpse of the monster signaled the collapse of Crete's absolute power. Before him, the open sea promised the birth of a new kingdom and the beginning of a legendary age. Theseus had not only saved his own life, but had also pulled 13 innocent companions back from the grip of death, young people who had felt the monster's breath on their necks deep within the labyrinth. The 7 young men and 7 young women whom Athens sent to Crete as tribute every 9 years, had, thanks to Theseus's courage and Ariadne's intelligence, managed to escape alive from this dark tomb from which not a single soul had ever returned before. When the youths reached daylight, they were still shaken by the horror they had endured. Yet the sight of Theseus, bloodied but dignified, restored the hope they had lost. Theseus had kept his promise and had ended forever the cursed debt of human sacrifice that weighed on Athens. Still, freedom was not yet fully secured, for once it became known that the monster had been killed and the victims had escaped, King Minos's fury would be harsher than the steep cliffs of Crete. Theseus proved that he was not only a warrior, but also a far-sighted strategist by devising a plan. King Minos, the absolute ruler of Crete, possessed a vast and seemingly unbeatable fleet. Even if the Athenian youths reached the harbor and boarded their ship, Minos's fast galleys could overtake them at sea and capture them again. To eliminate this danger, Theseus carried out a brilliant act of sabotage, either before entering the labyrinth or immediately after leaving it. According to PERIPHETES, Theseus bored holes in the hulls of all the Cretan ships in the harbor and smashed their keels, staving in the bottoms of the Cretan ships. Thanks to this secret move, when the Athenian ship set sail, the Cretan soldiers who rushed out to pursue them would face a bitter surprise. Every Cretan ship that left the harbor would quickly take on water, making pursuit impossible. Some sources also record that during this escape, a clash occurred in the harbor, and that Minos's arrogant general Taurus was killed in this sea fight. In the deep darkness of midnight, Theseus, the 13 youths he had saved, and Princess Ariadne, who had abandoned her homeland for love, silently boarded the 30-oared galley waiting in the harbor. The helmsman, Nauset House of Salamis, and the lookout, Phaeax, judged the direction of the wind and filled the sails. The ship still carried the mournful black sails it had borne when it left Athens, but the souls aboard were no longer sacrificial prisoners. They were free people who had brought a monster and the unjust laws of a great empire to their knees. The wind began to blow in the Athenians' favor, and the ship headed out into the deep blue waters of the Aegean Sea, leaving behind the Cretan fleet helplessly sinking in the harbor due to the sabotage. As Theseus stood at the stern, gazing at the receding shores of Crete, he felt the power of his divine father Poseidon in his veins and carried the dignified pride of being a people's savior. Their destination was first the island of Naxos, also called Dia, and then Athens, where his sorrowful father Aegeus awaited him. This escape was recorded not only as the salvation of 14 young lives, but also as the moment when Crete's absolute dominance of the seas was shaken, and Athens's legendary hero began to step onto the stage of history as a true king. Yet the ship, gliding over the blue waves of the Aegean, carried with it not only victory, but also the burden of tragic forgetfulness and the unfinished love that would be left behind on the shores of Naxos. Once the massive walls of Crete and its deadly labyrinth were left behind, Theseus and the young Athenians traveling with him set out onto the rough waters of the Aegean Sea with a great sense of relief, freed at last from the heavy burden of being sacrificial victims. The heroic prince, who had neutralized the Cretan fleet through brilliant sabotage, turned the course of his 30-oared galley northward toward the mainland. Yet the exhaustion of the journey and the relentless waves of the sea steered the ship toward a place of rest. The sheltered shores of the island, known in antiquity as Dia, today called Naxos. When the ship anchored by the calm beach behind the island's steep cliffs, the moonlight stretched across the water like a silver path. Theseus stepped ashore not only with Ariadne, to whom he owed his life, but also with the 13 youths he had drawn out of the darkness of the labyrinth. That night, Naxos appeared like a corner of paradise for the fugitives. The taste of victory and salvation blended with the island's fresh breeze. However, the plan that fate had prepared for Theseus did not align with Ariadne's sacrifice. For centuries, historians and poets failed to reach agreement on the true reasons behind the tragedy that unfolded on the shores of Naxos that night. According to the most common and sorrowful version, Theseus quietly set sail and left Ariadne behind on the deserted island while she lay in a deep sleep on the sand. When Ariadne awoke, she saw the black-sailed ship disappearing on the horizon and was devastated by grief. According to some sources, the reason behind Theseus's unfaithful act was a terrible passion he felt for another woman, Aegle, the daughter of Panopeus. It was even rumored that the Athenian statesman Pisistratus removed this line of betrayal from the poems of Hesiod in order to protect Theseus's reputation. Another version gives the story a more tragic and human dimension. According to Paeon of Amathus, when the ship reached the shores of Naxos, Ariadne was suffering from severe seasickness and was also pregnant by Theseus. Theseus brought his wife ashore so she could recover, but at that very moment, a violent storm drove the ship out to open sea. As Theseus struggled to save the vessel, he was carried away, while Ariadne was left alone and helpless on the island. The women of the island took Ariadne in and tried to comfort her with letters made to look as though they had come from Theseus. Yet the young princess died during childbirth without ever seeing his return. When Theseus finally came back, what he found was nothing but deep sorrow. In Ariadne's honor, he had statues of silver and bronze erected and ordered the people to offer sacrifices in her name. The Naxians' own local traditions crowned the story with divine intervention. According to them, there were actually 2 different Ariadnes and 2 different Minoses on the island. The first was a joyful queen remembered with festivals, while the second was the sorrowful woman abandoned by Theseus. As the abandoned Ariadne wept and cried out on the shore, Dionysos, Bacchus, the god of wine and ecstasy, heard her cries and descended to the island. Believing that Theseus did not deserve this noble woman, Dionysos claimed her and wished to make his love for her immortal. The god hurled the magnificent crown from Ariadne's brow into the sky. Its jewels turned one by one into shining flames and took their place among the stars. Today, Ariadne's crown, Corona Borealis, shining in the sky between the serpent-bearer and the kneeling hero, is seen as a god's loyalty set against a hero's betrayal. In some accounts, it is also recorded that Ariadne married Dionysus and bore him sons such as Staphylos and Phanes. Theseus's departure from Naxos went down in history as the first major stain on his image as a flawless hero. Plutarch described Theseus's abandonment of Ariadne as an act that was neither honorable nor decent. Yet heroism is often sealed with a great cost and the heavy forgetfulness that comes with it. On the shores of Naxos, Theseus left behind not only the woman he loved, but also the vital promise he had made to his father, Aegeus. If he returned victorious from Crete, he was supposed to take down the black sails and raise white ones instead, or bright red sails dyed with crimson. But the emotional turmoil experienced on Naxos, the intoxication of victory, or that hidden passion for another woman, clouded the minds of both Theseus and the helmsman. This first price would begin to make itself felt as Theseus approached Athens. The hero had defeated the monster in the Labyrinth and freed a people, yet the cost of breaking a heart and forgetting a promise on Naxos would claim the life of an aging father waiting on the walls of Athens. As Ariadne's sobs echoed across the deserted beaches of Naxos, Theseus's ship sped toward its destiny. But the black sails still hung from the mast, signaling not victory, but the morning that was about to come. After escaping the dark passages of Crete and the grip of the Minotaur, and after rendering the Cretan ships in the harbor useless through a brilliant act of sabotage, Theseus and the young Athenians set sail. At their first stop, the island of Naxos, Ariadne was left behind through a twist of fate and divine intervention, and the group then turned its course north toward the mainland. On the 30-oared galley gliding over the deep blue waters of the Aegean Sea, a powerful sense of joy and victory filled the air, the relief of having escaped sacrifice at last. Yet according to the sources, this excitement and exultation caused a fatal forgetfulness that clouded the minds of both Theseus and the helmsman. Before leaving Athens, Theseus had made a vital agreement with his father, King Aegeus. The ship had departed the harbor carrying black sails, a sign of certain death. However, Aegeus had given the helmsman a second sail to be raised in case of victory. According to Plutarch, this sail was pure white. According to Simonides, it was a bright red color, dyed with the fresh blossom of the leafy oak. Aegeus gave clear instructions to his son and to the helmsman. If Theseus were alive and had defeated the monster, they were to raise this white or red sail as they approached the harbor, so the king could see the news from afar. But as they neared the coast of Attica, the greatness of their success caused Theseus and his helmsman, Phereclus or Nausitaus, to completely forget this sacred promise. The ship continued toward the walls of Athens, with the ominous black sails still raised on its mast. This moment of forgetfulness laid the groundwork for one of the greatest tragedies of the ancient world. Meanwhile in Athens, King Aegeus had been watching the horizon day and night from a rock, according to some accounts on the Acropolis, according to others at Cape Sunion. When the aging king saw the black sails of the approaching ship, his world collapsed. Believing that he had failed to save his son from sacrifice and that Theseus was dead, Aegeus, overwhelmed by grief and despair, threw himself from the rocks below. The sources record that his body was either shattered against the cliffs or lost in the depths of the sea. According to Apollodorus, the waters into which the king leapt came to be called the Aegean Sea in order to preserve his memory forever. This death marked both the fulfillment of a prophecy and the sorrowful cost of a heroic saga, for the secrets Pythias had once sensed and concealed ultimately led Aegeus at the height of joy, when the mouth of the wineskin was loosened, to his own end. Unaware of all this, Theseus set foot in the harbor of Phalerum. He paused on the shore to personally offer the sacrifices he had vowed to the gods and appointed a herald to carry the news of victory to the city. When the herald entered Athens, he found the people divided. On one side, joyful crowds celebrating the safe return of the young captives. On the other, those mourning the death of their king. The people greeted the herald with wreaths for the good news, but he wrapped them around his staff and remained silent for a time, so as not to disturb Theseus's libation ritual. Only after the sacrifices were completed did Theseus learn of his father's death from the herald. At that moment, the victory he had won in the labyrinth was replaced by deep sorrow and regret. The young hero had gone forth as a doomed captive and returned as a savior. Yet as he opened the palace gates as a king, he had left behind a woman who loved him and a father who had given his life. This tragic return left lasting marks on the cultural life of Athens. After burying his father, Theseus fulfilled his vows to Apollo on the 7th day of the month Paenepsion. In memory of this day, traditions were established. The custom of pulse boiling, in which the surviving youths boiled and ate together the last remaining provisions from the ship in a single pot, and the ritual of the Erisione, in which olive branches decorated with wool were carried in procession. In addition, the festival of Oskophoria was held to commemorate the return of the two brave youths who had boarded the ship disguised as young women. During this festival, vine branches were carried in honor of Dionysus and Ariadne, and processions of supper carriers were formed, symbolizing mothers bringing food to their sacrificial children. Though Theseus sealed his victory with mourning beneath the shadow of the black sail, this event became the final great turning point that secured his legitimacy in Athens and transformed him into a legend. The herald who carried the bitter news of his father's fate remained respectfully silent until Theseus had completed the sacrificial rites. But once the ceremony ended, the truth stood bare and unavoidable. Theseus had returned to the city he had left as a sacrificial captive, as a savior, yet the lifeless body of his father stood before him as the heaviest price of his victory. After burying his father in deep mourning, he fulfilled his vows to Apollo on the 7th day of the month Paenepsion. This day was sealed in Athenian history as a turning point marked by both grief and deliverance. The death of King Aegeus was not only a dynastic change, but was also immortalized through the naming of a place. The sources record that the waters into which the aged king threw himself thereafter came to be called the Aegean Sea in his memory, as a lasting sign of Theseus's victory. This naming was etched onto the map of the ancient world as a testament to a father's boundless love for his son and to a hero's tragic forgetfulness. After completing his mourning, Theseus ascended the throne of Athens and was recognized as the rightful ruler. Yet he did not content himself with being a merely traditional king. His mind was set on a far greater and more revolutionary design. Shortly after taking the throne, he resolved to bring together under a single authority the many small and large settlements scattered across Attica, which often clashed with one another and struggled to pursue their common interests. Theseus visited each village and tribe in turn, persuading them to unite. The poor and the lower classes accepted this proposal at once, trusting in Theseus's sense of justice. But to convince powerful chieftains and nobles, he offered a more radical promise. Instead of absolute monarchy, he proposed a democracy, a pure commonwealth without a king. He himself would remain only as commander of the army and guardian of the laws, while in all other matters, all citizens would enjoy equal rights. In accordance with this grand design, he abolished the local town halls, praetornea, council buildings, and local administrations in the outlying towns. In their place, he established a single shared center of government and assembly for all the people of Attica at the site of what is now the Acropolis. He officially named the city Athens and founded the Panathenaic festival to celebrate this union and bring all Athenians together. In addition to honor newcomers from abroad, he instituted the festival of Metoesia. To maintain order within this new system, Theseus divided the people into three classes: the Eupatridae, nobles, the Geomori, farmers, and the Demiurgi, artisans. He entrusted the nobles with the administration of religious rites, the selection of magistrates, and the interpretation of the laws, yet made them equal in rights to the other classes. As Aristotle noted, Theseus was the first ruler to incline toward the masses and to share his absolute authority with the people. Even Homer, when mentioning the Athenians in the catalogue of ships, referred to them simply as the people, demos, alluding to this democratic structure. To strengthen economic independence, Theseus minted coins bearing the image of an ox. This symbol was either a reference to the Marathonian bull or an effort to encourage agriculture among the people. He expanded his borders by attaching Megara to Attica and erected the famous boundary stone on the Isthmus of Corinth. On one side, he inscribed, "This is not the Peloponnese, but Ionia," and on the other, "This is the Peloponnese, not Ionia," thereby proclaiming the extent of his rule to the world. The reign of Theseus became legendary not only for its political achievements, but also for the unshakable place he won in the hearts of his people. Throughout his life, he was a defender of the poor and the oppressed, and through this role, he came to be seen not merely as a living king, but as a figure of almost divine stature. Inspired by his admiration for Heracles, he followed in his path, and the phrase, "This is another Heracles," became common on the lips of the people. The legend of the king continued long after his death. During the Persian Wars, especially at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE, many Athenian soldiers claimed to have seen the ghost of Theseus, armed in armor, charging against the barbarians. In response to this miraculous report, the oracle at Delphi ordered the Athenians to find the bones of Theseus, bring them back to Athens, and build him a sacred tomb. In 475 BCE, seamen captured the island of Skyros and discovered the massive coffin of Theseus, along with his bronze spear and sword, at a spot where an eagle was seen clawing at the earth. When these remains were brought to Athens, Theseus was received with great ceremonies, as if he had just returned from Crete as a king, and was buried at the heart of the city near the site of today's gymnasium. His tomb became, in keeping with his life's mission, an eternal refuge for runaway slaves and for the poor who feared oppression. Theseus completed the journey he had begun as a voluntary sacrifice, as the founder of an empire and the eternal protector of a people. On the 8th day of every month, especially in the month of Pyanepsion, he continued to be honored alongside his divine father, Poseidon, god of the seas, for Theseus had become not only the king of Athens, but its very soul. As the sun sinks over the deep blue waters of the Aegean Sea, painting the sky the red of a sacrificial fire, the story of Theseus comes to an end not merely with the death of a hero, but with the immortality of an idea. The man who emerged victorious from the bloody corridors of Crete, who solved the impossible twists of the labyrinth through a woman's love and the loyalty of a linen thread, returned to Athens as more than just the son of Poseidon or the heir of Aegeus. He became the living proof that the impossible can be made possible, Yet mythology always drags shadow wherever there is light. Theseus's victory turned into tragedy when his father Aegeus cast himself into the dark waters of the sea, and the hero's crown was woven with a wreath of mourning. When Theseus ascended the throne of Athens, he surrounded the city not only with walls, but with laws and justice. By uniting scattered villages, he fulfilled the ideal of synoikismos and transformed Athens from chaos into the capital of order. But his true greatness was hidden in his endless admiration for his cousin Heracles. While Heracles symbolized brute strength and the slaying of monsters, Theseus represented the thinking hero. As he walked among his people, when he took the hand of an oppressed victim or humbled the arrogance of a tyrant, the streets echoed with these words, "This is another Heracles." That sentence was the greatest medal the ancient world bestowed upon Theseus. He placed physical power at the service of reason and law. In his old age, gazing at the sea from the marble terrace of his palace, he likely thought this: killing a monster was easier than ruling a city, for the Minotaur had only one body and one horn. But human ambition and jealousy, like the 50 ambitious Palantid nephews of Athens, were a 1,000-headed hydra. Time flowed like a wind that erodes marble, and Theseus died on the island of Skyros, where he had been exiled by the very people he once saved, at the edge of a cliff. But the death of a hero does not mean the end of his story. On the contrary, it is merely the incubation period of a legend. In 490 BC, when the Athenians faced the Persian army on the plain of Marathon, one of history's strangest testimonies was recorded. At the most terrifying moment of the battle, when Athenian soldiers were beginning to lose hope, it was said that a shadow descended from the sky. Through the cloud of dust, the soldiers saw a man appear, his bronze armor gleaming, a massive spear in his hand, his stance dignified and calm. This was the ghost of Theseus, dead for centuries. That day, Theseus had risen from his grave and charged at the front lines against the Persians for the freedom of the city he himself had founded. This vision was the clearest reflection of the protective ancestor figure in the collective consciousness of the ancient world. Years later, guided by the signs of wise seers, the statesman Timon traveled to the island of Skyros. At a spot marked as if by a sign from the heavens, where an eagle clawed at the earth, they began to dig. What emerged from the ground was a massive coffin, far larger than that of an ordinary man, and beside it a rusted but still imposing bronze spear and sword. Theseus was brought back to Athens with great ceremonies, to the very heart of the city, as if he were a king freshly returned from Crete. He was no longer just a hero of myth, he had become the eternal guardian of Athens. Today, although those marble columns have collapsed and the swords are displayed behind museum glass, the story of Theseus is more alive than ever. Because we, as modern people, are still wandering inside our own labyrinths. The palaces of Knossos of our time are no longer made of marble. They are built from streams of data, digital algorithms, complex financial systems, and the endless information pollution created by social media. The Minotaur of today is not merely a physical monster. It is the loneliness, anxiety, insatiable desire for consumption, and sense of alienation within modern humanity. Every morning, we step into corridors ready to swallow us whole. So, what is the thread of Ariadne that Theseus left to us today? That thread is truth and memory. It is the only thing that keeps us from losing our way in chaos. the only thing that ties us back to our starting point, our core human values. The modern world constantly offers us new paths, new shortcuts, and bright galleries with no exit. The legacy of Theseus whispers this to us. If you let go of the thread in your hand, you become nothing more than a victim inside the labyrinth. One of philosophy's most famous paradoxes, the ship of Theseus, confronts us today in fields ranging from artificial intelligence to biotechnology. The ship on which Theseus returned from Crete was preserved for years in the harbor of Athens, and every rotting plank was replaced with a new one. When not a single original piece remained, was it still the ship of Theseus? That question is us today. With bodies whose cells renew every 7 years and minds updated daily with new information, are we still the same person? Theseus teaches us that identity is not hidden in matter, but in narrative and purpose. The planks of the ship may change, but what makes it the ship of Theseus is the story it carries and the harbor it reaches. No matter how much we change through technology, as long as the passion for justice and heroism within us, our story remains. We continue to be ourselves. The tomb of Theseus at the heart of Athens was, in ancient times, a sacred refuge for runaway slaves, the poor, and those fleeing the cruelty of tyrants. The door of that tomb was never locked, because the spirit of the hero embraced everyone. Today, that sacred refuge is no longer a physical place, but a state of mind. Whenever we raise our voice against injustice, whenever we sacrifice our own safety to save another life, we once again take up the sword and sandals beneath that dusty rock. The epic of Theseus is not merely about a prince killing a monster. It is about humanity's will to take destiny into its own hands, to move that massive stone, and to find its own path, the end of the thread within the darkness. Now, as you slowly open your eyes or drift into sleep with the echo of this story, remember this: each of us has a mountain to overcome. Each of us carries a Poseidon-like power waiting to be awakened, and each of us has in our pocket that thin, unbreakable linen thread that will lead us to the light. The ship of Theseus is still sailing. All we need to do is feel the wind and stay awake enough to notice the poison in our cup. I hope that as you end your day, this ancient epic has been a good story for you. I look forward to your comments and requests. Do not forget to follow my channel. May the darkness of the night and the rhythm of the sea bring you peace. Until we meet again in another legend, in the breath of another hero. Love.